Like with China and with the Ottoman Empire, the Japanese were confronted with Western aggression. And this came a little bit later in Japan, and the challenge didn't come from Europeans, but rather from Americans. In 1853, United States Commodore Matthew Perry arrived in Tokyo Bay with a fleet of steamships. And Perry came with a not so subtle message that if Japan didn't open up their nation to more Western trade, they were going to be in trouble. When Perry arrived in Japan, Japan was ruled by the Tokugawa shogunate, and the shogun was the leader of feudal Japan. The Tokugawa came to power in 1603. The Tokugawa shogunate was the central government, but the local rulers had a lot of authority in their own domains. The local feudal lords were known as daimyo, and each daimyo had their own army of warriors, known as samurai. The central Tokugawa government controlled landlords by forcing the daimyo to spend every second year in the capital, Edo, which today is Tokyo. And they would spend this year away from their families. The Tokugawa shogunate was essentially holding the families of the daimyo hostage periodically, just to make sure that the daimyo fell in line. In early Tokugawa Japan, there was a strict social hierarchy. The daimyo at the top, followed by the samurai warriors, followed by the peasants, then craftspeople, and finally at the bottom were merchants. And a merchant wasn't considered to be a noble profession in Japan. Problems emerged with the samurai during the Tokugawa period because it was a period of relative peace, so the importance of the traditional warrior class was diminished. Over time, the samurai were transformed more into a bureaucratic class that served the daimyo. At the same time, the economy of Japan was growing because of the peace, and the growing economy meant that there were new opportunities for merchants to make a lot of money and to improve their stock in society. So this created a lot of social tension because it turned the social hierarchy upside down. In many cases, daimyo found it necessary to go out and try to get loans from merchants who are considered to be socially inferior. The samurai, for their part, were infuriated with their diminished social position, so we see a large movement of peasants leaving the countryside, coming to the city, trying to become merchants. The shogun tried to say this wasn't allowed, but people didn't really listen, so you begin to see there's this lack of control. And in the immediate years leading up to Perry's visit, there's a famine in the 1830s that led to peasant uprisings in the countryside and riots in the cities. So from the 1830s onward, the shogunate is beginning to lose control. When the Tokugawa came to power at the beginning of the 17th century, they kicked out Christian missionaries and limited trade with the West to just one port on a remote island that only the Dutch were allowed to trade at. And the Japanese favored the Dutch because they thought they weren't as concerned with spreading Christianity as other European powers. But by the early 1800s, just like in China, European powers and now the United States were knocking at the door, wanting to get into the country. The Tokugawa wanted none of this. When Commodore Perry arrived in 1853, he came with a fleet of steamships that were bigger than anything the Japanese had ever seen before, and he came ashore and essentially demanded that the Japanese open up ports for trade and told the representatives of the shogun that he would be back in spring for their answer. This sparked a debate within Japan. Should Japan prepare for war with the United States, or should they give in to the demands of the United States? And ultimately, they decided not to go to war and to accept the demands of the United States. Japan had seen what had happened to China in the Opium War and didn't want to suffer the same fate. But this decision was seen by many Japanese as humiliation, and ultimately led to a brief civil war that was led by a group of young samurai from southern Japan. The Tokugawa shogun was overthrown, and the Emperor of Japan, who was mainly a figurehead during the Tokugawa period, was returned to power. This emperor was a 15-year-old boy whose throne name was Meiji, or Enlightened Ruler, and this event became known as the Meiji Restoration. Now with the shogun gone, Meiji and his advisors made it their mission to save Japan from foreign domination. Japan knew it could not accomplish this by fighting against the West, but instead embarked on a large-scale reshaping of Japanese society that drew from anything and everything the modern West had to offer. Japan was in a better position to do Westernization rapidly than China, because in China, if you remember, the Taiping Uprising was defeated, whereas in Japan, the Meiji Restoration was successful. Japan was less important to Western powers than China. There's a huge potential for riches in China. It was less important than the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire occupied a more strategic location at the crossroads of Asia and Europe. And the American Civil War and the aftermath sort of curbed American ambition in the Pacific for a short period of time, but it gave the Japanese a little bit of room to breathe and to grow as an industrialized nation. So, following the Meiji Restoration, the new rulers of Japan took advantage of this small window of opportunity and transformed Japan in a way that was much more radical than the Ottoman and Chinese empires. The first goal of the new rulers was to establish national unity, and the Meiji viewed the daimyo and the samurai as an obstacle to creating a national identity. In 1871, the Meiji rulers abolished daimyo domains and replaced them with prefectures. The Meiji rulers appointed their own governors that were responsible to the central Meiji government. A unified Japanese military was created, and this conscripted members from all social classes. Samurai were stripped of their role as the warrior class and lost the right to carry swords in public. So essentially the old social hierarchy was completely dismantled, and all people were declared legally equal as commoners. Initially in Meiji Japan, there was loads of enthusiasm for anything Western, but later on, Japan would take on a more critical approach of adopting Western things. Japan did adopt many things from the West, but not everything, and in many instances, they created their own versions of Western things. For example, a constitution did come to Japan in 1889, and the constitution included elected parliament and political parties, democratic ideals, but the constitution wasn't presented to Japanese society as something that people naturally had a right to, that it was their rights as human beings to have this constitution, but rather the constitution was presented as a gift from the sacred emperor who was descended from the sun goddess. So going back much further in history, Japan had a long history of selective borrowing from China, copying and adapting what they thought would work for them and using it to their own advantage. And this is different than both China, where there was a long history of disdain for outside cultures, for barbarian cultures. There was a Middle Kingdom, and different from the Islamic world, which for a long time had a really hard time seeing anything of value in the West because the West was full of infidels. This is the end of episode 22, Internal and External Threats, 1800 to 1914. Thanks for listening.